for Lower Merion. My name is Annie Dennison. I am the co-founder of Stand Up for Lower Merion with the inimitable Adrian Seltzer. We're very happy to welcome Anita Friday, who's going to walk us through the idea of critical race theory, what it is and what it isn't. But first, Adrian is going to give us a little civics lesson. She's going to talk about the upcoming election, things we need to remember. So, Adrian.
So I am going to share my screen.
Oh, what happened?
He's trying to share his screen.
Right.
Okay, can everyone see?
Yes.
All right. This is about why local government and the elections are important. And it's important to be informed. And it especially goes with today's presentation from Anita, because certain things are being vilified that aren't true. So please mark your calendars. The election's on November 2nd, 2021. Look at all the people you'll be voting for in this, what is generally called an off-year election, but those of us that are involved don't like that term. We like to call it an odd-year election. And it is for tons of local positions, your township commissioners, borough council, your school directors. Oops, wait a minute, wrong way. Your school directors, 4 of them 9. And a lot of the appellate court system, judges in the Supreme Commonwealth and Superior Court, your Monco Court of Common Pleas, and magisterial district judges. Polling positions are up. Judge of elections, I'm one of those, so I'm up for election. Inspectors is my daughter, she's up also. Jury commissioner, constable, township tax collector, and possibly some ballot questions. And this is why the local government elections matter. They oversee police and emergency services. This is your borough council or your commissioners. And all this other stuff that you can look through, and it's all stuff that affects your daily life. It's taxation, property values, and whether your basement gets flooded, just preservation of historic properties. And then you have your school directors. In Lower Merion, there's a large district with over 8,700 students, and they're both from Lower Merion and Narberth. They oversee a vast budget, and it's paid for by your property taxes, which the board is responsible for levying. Things that apply to like today's discussion is they set district-wide curriculum. Do you want a curriculum that is true and inclusive, or do you want the same old, same old? Ask your school board candidates these questions. They determine school disciplinary rules, and they review policies and determine goals, but they are under the constraint of the federal and state regulations. This is the PA court system we have, and a lot of people don't know about that. You have your minor courts, which are in Lower Merion, Narberth, are your district justices. They're part of the minor courts. Then you have your Court of Common Pleas, that's your county court. And then the appellate court system, which is your Superior, Commonwealth, and Supreme Court. So those are all things that make up the hierarchy of the PA court system. Some interesting facts. Once judges are elected, they no longer run on a partisan basis, and they are in a different part of your ballot under retentions. And people vote yes or no to keep them or not keep them. They're able to retire at age 70. They have to retire at age 75, and they can be retained for as many times as they want. If there's any vacancy, it's filled by the governor with Senate confirmation. Oops, I'm sorry. District magisterial and municipal judges have 6-year terms, and they have to run every time. And cross-filing, which means you can run as a Democrat or a Republican, is allowed for a Court of Common Pleas, magisterial justices, and municipal judges. Philadelphia has municipal judges. It's also allowed for a school board, but that's not judicial. And the reason why these are so important is because they interpret PA law and the Constitution. They determine cash bail and sentencing. They oversee employment and discrimination cases, and they interpret election law and election issues. And they oversee candidate and ballot challenges. So are you ready for election day? Quick, get out your phone and take a picture of the QR code. Go check your voter status now at pavotes.com, which you can do with that. Here are some important dates. And there's also different ways to vote. You can vote at the polls on election day. You can vote by mail-in or absentee ballot. You can apply now for those, or in person at your county board of elections or satellite office. If you do vote in person at your county board of elections or satellite office, it's kind of like doing a mail-in ballot without the mail. And if you would like more information, I thought I had this to go, everything to come out once, but I messed up. So here's more information on Onco Voter Services. Learn about your candidates for school board, judges, etc. Remind your friends and family to register and vote, and make your own plan to vote. And for those of you in Lower Merion and Narberth, don't forget to fill out the Lower Merion School District Communication Survey. We send a reminder out in our emails, and we keep hearing the same issues about communication and transparency in the school district. We want your opinions, recommendations, and ideas on how to make it easier to engage with the school board and district. And that survey, we invite you to answer the questions as well as share your own thoughts in the space at the end of the survey. And here's the link. All right. And the end. Anyone have any questions? I guess not. Well, then what I am going to do, give me a second while I exit out of this and go here. One second. That's wonderful. Hold for me a sec. I have to figure out which email stuff was sent to me in.
Adrian, there was a question in the chat as to whether there are any school board candidates. at
Here?
this-
Melody Schaffmeister. I have my Invisaligns in. It's really hard for me to talk. And
Mary Brown?
Mary Brown, who's a Democrat running as a Republican,
Why?
because that's how she could get on the board, on the ballot. And I did have my introduction for Anita in here somewhere, and I cannot find it. So one more chance. Yes, got it. Thank you for your patience, everyone. I would like to introduce Anita Friday, who is the founder of Open Hearts, a path for racial healing. Anita is a retired attorney and has done extensive teaching, facilitation, and training around the issues of ethnicity and its past and current impact on our nation and its residents. And I would like to welcome her and thank her so much for doing this for us.
Thank you, Adrian, and greetings, everyone. Some friends, old friends, and hopefully some new friends. And this whole issue about CRT, what does it mean, why it's ruining the lives of children in our community has been something that is a false issue that is being spread across our nation. So what I want to do is just do a brief slide presentation and then have a discussion about what it is and why the objections. So I'm going to do a share screen now. Okay, let me make this. So, diversity, equity, and inclusion, critical race theory. What's the big deal? Okay. To get my. You have to give
technology.
Me technology, yeah. Oops. We'll get it there. We'll get it together. Okay. So there's something that Lower Merion School District and other school districts have recently adopted, and they've decided to make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion are a part of what is in the schools. And some of the issues that we have are just with respect to definition. What is diversity in our schools? Now, we hear people opposing diversity because sometimes people feel that it only makes reference to people who are Black. But it's important, and I'm giving you these definitions because I think that we're all going to be engaging in conversations with friends and neighbors and people we know who don't understand. But diversity is socioeconomic diversity. It includes race and ethnicity, language, gender, sexual orientation, exceptionalities, religion, and multicultural education. One of the things that I found ironic is that a lot of people who object to diversity in schools are excited to push their children in accelerated learning and gifted programs. Children who are able to participate in these programs are part of a diverse segment of the population with exceptionalism. And we know that the schools have been happy to accommodate those students. But again, it's important that diversity does include race and ethnicity, but it includes so much more. And I hope that when you speak with people who object, you let them understand clearly that all of these variables are what is included in the term diversity. Now, diversity among students in education directly impacts their performance. There are all kinds of studies that show that students work better in a diverse environment. It enables them to concentrate and push themselves further when there are people of other backgrounds working alongside them. And diversity among staff is also important. One of the things that I hope that you talk to your school board members about is hiring and ensuring that their staff, teachers, administrators, all of the staff are diverse. And again, if we look at this image, remember diversity includes more than just race, because we know that race is a buzzword that causes people to react irrationally at times. So then the next thing that the school boards are working on is equity. And so what does equity in the classroom mean? It means making sure that every student has the resources and support they need to be successful. In an equitable classroom, individual factors don't hold students back from reaching their full learning potential. Factors like race, special needs, economic background, and language difference don't hold people back. You know, one of the things that happens that folks may not think about is even the book drives that schools often have, where students get to buy their scholastic books. There may be children, because of economic diversity, who can't afford the books. And what does the school do to ensure that there is opportunity for all students to get the resources that they need? I have a cousin who was at Lower Merion High School, and I had some materials that my children had used for college prep that I was going to drop off at school to give to him. And when I went to the office to drop off the books, I was told by the secretary to leave the materials under the flagpole, and they would text the children. Now, that is not a system that promotes equity, because clearly not every child in the Lower Merion School District or any school district has a cell phone or access to texting. Those are the types of things that schools need to think about when establishing procedures and equitable procedures for their students. Now, equality would say we text everyone, but again, that doesn't take into account the fact that everyone doesn't have cell phones. Equality in education is achieved when all students are treated the same and have access to similar resources. As I said before, the goal of equality is something that doesn't happen in a world where there is the diversity that we all know exists. Equity is achieved when all students receive the resources they need so they can graduate prepared for success after high school. Now, the other wing to the diversity, equity, and inclusion is inclusion. And oftentimes we see that diversity is the goal. And I can't count the number of times I've looked at corporate or school brochures where you see the same children of color on every other page, and those institutions are touting their diversity. But if you look at this graphic, inclusion exists when people are together and have an opportunity to share and be valued within the community that they exist. So the mere counting of faces does not yield inclusion. And so one of the things that schools and institutions need to think about is, what can we do to make people feel included? And even referring back to the example I gave about the school books, inclusion would mean that there's a fund, a discrete fund that ensures that all children, even those who are from economically less advantaged circumstance, have an opportunity to purchase the book when there's the book there at the school. That's just one sort of simple example. Inclusive education means that all students can access and fully participate in learning alongside their similarly aged peers, supported by reasonable adjustments and teaching strategies tailored to meet their individual needs. Why is diversity, equity, and inclusion important in education? Diversity and inclusion improves teaching and learning. People learn and enrich their abilities to think critically and creatively when they engage in conversations across difference, especially when all learners' abilities and attributes are embraced. Teaching for diversity refers to acknowledging the range of differences in the classroom. Teaching for inclusion signifies embracing the difference. Teaching for equity allows the differences to transform the way we think, teach, learn, and act, such that all experiences and ways of being are handled with fairness and justice. Now, I don't think, or I hope that those who are objecting to CRT don't object to these principles. Now, critical race theory is an academic movement for civil rights scholars and activists in the United States who seek to critically examine the law and how it intersects with issues of race and challenge the mainstream liberal approach of racial justice. So what critical race theory has done is it studies the law and how law and the infrastructures that it creates have fostered racial inequalities, how the law has done that. You know, we had commitment to equality when the 14th Amendment was made a part of the Constitution, but that goal has never been achieved. And the laws that have been enacted and the systems that are a part of our nation have never operated in a way to bring to bearing the goals of the 14th Amendment or the Equal Rights Amendment. I'm going to share now just a academician's talk on critical race theory.
Anyway, so I decided to get someone on the show tonight who is an actual expert on critical race theory and much more. This way we can all understand what critical race theory is about and how we can develop a better judgment about the current push to ban it from schools in the red states. So joining me now is Dr. Amani Perry, Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. Professor Perry, I'll say Dr. Perry. I know they say PhDs come a dime a dozen. I don't buy that. So I'm going to say your expertise matters. And I'm going to ask you very clearly, what is critical race theory?
Okay.
What is critical race theory, Doc?
Thank you for having me. So the most straightforward way to explain critical race theory is to begin with the civil rights movement, right? So the victories of the movement, which we all know, are found in federal legislation, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, but also in anti-discrimination law, essentially laws that declared Jim Crow policies unconstitutional. So after that moment, we begin to understand, of course, that Black people suffered many other forms of injury and had many systems of disadvantagement and inequality in their lives, right? And so legislatures and municipalities and organizations began to make specific efforts to target African Americans with programs to address current and past discrimination. And they faced a major conservative backlash. And the way that backlash was formed was saying, well, if you make programs to target the discrimination experienced by Black Americans and you don't include me, white person, then you are discriminating against me, right? And so they begin to attack programs like affirmative action and upward bound, et cetera. And the Supreme Court of the United States then really fails the civil rights movement by basically treating targeted programs to address racial inequality as the same form of discrimination as Jim Crow laws, right? That they are both are subject to immediate scrutiny, the strictest scrutiny. So we get to this point, and then civil rights lawyers and scholars begin to talk about how we have to be able to address subordination injustice, not just color consciousness. It's not enough to be colorblind. We actually have to be able to address injustice and subordination if we're going to have legal racial equality. And that's the heart of critical race theory. How to think about law, legislation, policies that will substantively respond to racial inequality. And they began to bring multiple forms of analysis to the table: history, narrative, gender, class, showing all the insidious ways that discrimination and inequality have been sedimented in American society, right? And then it blooms in multiple directions, but it is literally just a way of understanding the mechanics of racial inequality and how the law might be imagined to address them. Nothing more than that.
It's an important thing that you talked about, and you laid that out brilliantly. It doesn't really need any addendum by me. But you talked about this other issue of color blindness, which is an important thing, right? Because critical race theory has always rejected liberal colorblind theory. Ironically, because it's always accused of being this wild liberal theory, but in many ways, critical race theory said, hey, wait a minute. Colorblindness as the goal, as a social aspiration, is also problematic. We need to actually think about race. Doesn't mean that we obsess about race, doesn't mean that we prioritize one race over the other per se, but we need to think about race as another factor here.
Right. If you want to address inequality, you have to have data. In order to have data, you have to pay attention to where people from different segments of society are situated. You have to be able to look at the relationships between race and health outcomes, race and class, race and educational outcomes, right? And so if you are colorblind, and we have examples in other nations, Germany might be an example, where if you don't actually keep track of race, you have no mechanisms for addressing racial injustice. That is absolutely untenable in this country that has been organized from the outset around racial inequality. So it's a really, it's a problematic form of legal interpretation. But if we go a step further, if we can't even talk about it in schools, right, it actually has the potential to diminish our young people's ability to be sort of active civic participants, to understand the world they occupy and hopefully build a better society.
Speaking of schools, this whole hullabaloo began because Republican legislators said, we will not allow critical race theory to be taught in schools. Now, I used to teach high school. I've studied schools. I know people in school. I want to know where these schools are, where people are teaching all this critical race theory. This feels like a solution in search of a problem.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so this is a kind of conventional right-wing approach where they create a moral panic around an issue that actually doesn't really exist, right? And we can see a comparable move right now in targeting trans teens, right? They they sort of make up a problem and then drum up a lot of anxiety and a moral panic around it as a way to detract attention from their own failed policies and agendas. And unfortunately, because we have a society that is in which it's easy to ignite a variety of bigotries, they get a lot of traction out of it. But yes, I have taught critical race theory when I taught law school. I taught it many times. I am not aware of it being taught in high schools at all, in K-12 education, and only very rarely in college. I mean, it's not a kind of mainstream. It's not like teaching African American studies. It's not teaching the civil rights movement. It's a very kind of niche field that is largely in law schools and in schools of education at this point, graduate schools of education.
So, right. So this is a sort of interesting moment here. Then, so when they attack critical race theory, it seems like a cynical move. Then they don't know what it means clearly, but they also don't need to know what it means because it seems to be a code for something else.
It's a code for something, and they're also banking on the fact that the general public doesn't know what it means, and that's okay because it's not really a mainstream theory, right? And so they're drumming up anxiety, and it becomes very difficult for those who disagree with them to even engage, because who knows what critical race theory means besides academics, frankly, and some lawyers, right? So I do think
Right.
it's cynical, but on the other hand, I do think there's one piece that is very important to be mindful of. It is really clear that they are outraged at the idea that we would teach the history of the nation in an authentic way, with all of the details of the injustice, of the violence, of the inequality, of all of the isms. That is seen as a problem to them. They want to maintain the fiction of this country, the mythology of this country. And that's something that we do have to be very deliberate about responding to, because we want our kids to be raised with deep and meaningful knowledge.
So ultimately, when they say they don't want critical race theory in school, they really don't want race talk in school. They don't want a racial history in school. They don't want any kind of critical analysis of white supremacy in school.
Right. And I say, yes, all of that, but also they don't want a basically honest history of this nation, right? I mean, you don't have to have a critical analysis to know that slavery was wrong or that Jim Crow was unjust, right? That's not a deep analysis. That's a 5-year-old can understand that those things are unjust. So it's very alarming. I think we have to respond to it, but we cannot be held to their terms because their terms are deceptive.
Professor Amani Perry from Princeton University, thank you for giving us an expert analysis of critical race theory and making this plain.
So I attended a school board meeting in the Tredyffrin Easttown community where I live. And, one of the things that Dr. Perry said was terms, and a term being conflagrated to mean something that it isn't. And here are some of the objections that I've heard or seen to critical race theory, and I'm sure there are similar things happening in Lower Merion. So this paper that was put on people's mailbox is labeled Dangers of Critical Race Theory. Point 1, equity in terms of educational outcome cannot be guaranteed due to IQ, temperament, disabilities, determination, perception, religion, health, etc. Now, again, there's a conflagration of terms. No one with diversity, equity, and inclusion is asking for equal outcome. Everyone isn't going to be the best electrician. Everyone's not going to be a doctor. Everyone's not going to go to Penn or Harvard or Penn State. So to say that equity is attempting to guarantee those things is a falsehood that's being promulgated. Again, what equity says is merely that people are given the tools that they need to have the best outcome that they can have, to have a fair opportunity to learn, to participate, to realize their best self, given who they are and what they were born with. Point 2 for the objection. Whiteness, white culture, and white privilege condemn hard work and accountability. Let me read that one again. Whiteness, white culture, and white privilege condemn hard work and accountability. Now, what I find really interesting in that language is it's assuming that hard work and accountability are only characteristics that are attributable to so-called whiteness. And I dare anyone who has 2 millimeters of knowledge to tell me or prove to me that my relatives who were working in the cotton fields and chopping tobacco were not hardworking. Now, the other point is they say, and this is again what's said at a school board that isn't even dealing with CRT, that CRT and 1619 are based on emotion, not fact, virtue, not evidence. So history will be taught with bias. Now, when I was in school, I learned that manifest destiny was a justification for the Western expansion. I wasn't taught about the genocide of Indigenous people. I wasn't taught about Black pioneers. I wasn't taught about land grants that were made available to white pioneers, so that there was a system, a hierarchical system where whiteness sat on top. So I just would question how talking about true history is something that promotes bias as opposed to the history we're taught. Their fourth point is that the nuclear family will be dismantled and parents will slowly begin to lose the right to endow on their own children beliefs, values, and morals that align with their heritage. Let me read that again. The nuclear family will be dismantled and parents will slowly begin to lose the right to endow on their own children beliefs, values, and morals that align with their heritage. I don't even know what that means. Or maybe I don't want to know what that means, because I want to hope that the values and morals that we have, that we all have, are morals and values that stem for our children learning truth, fairness, and justice. Now, the fifth quote is really amazing. Diversity and inclusion. In other words, CRT agenda is code for Marxism and socialism. CRT, which they conflagrate with diversity and inclusion, is code for Marxism and socialism. Those are the talking points of people who object to diversity, equity, and inclusion in our school districts in this nation. Now, I did a little bit of, again, I live in TE, but I know that this group is primarily in Lower Merion, and I did a little bit of research preparing for today on the policies that were adopted by the school district in June this year. What Lower Merion says is that they're committed to providing a safe, supportive, and inclusive learning environment for all people. Why is this policy necessary? Because they haven't done it in the past. There are huge disparities in the achievement gap for people of color. As we said before, it's important to have representation of all sorts of folks in the community being valued. Having diverse teachers is valued, and the school district hasn't done it. They also say that it's dedicated to ensuring that all students and employees have equitable access to the district's educational programs and activities. Again, the example that I gave before about buying books or having access to information that's dropped off by parents or family members. In their policy, they say educational equity is a shared commitment to ensure that every student gets what they need to be successful. Now, it's important to remember that success is not a monolithic term. But to be successful means to be able to achieve what it is that you are able to achieve to maximize your human potential. And they go on to say that practicing equity in this district means understanding the needs of individuals and positioning resources, including funding, programs, policies, initiatives, and supports to target people's unique experiences and to provide for individual needs so that the achievement and opportunity gaps are limited on personal and systemic levels. Now, again, I'm going to sort of go back to what I was saying about all of those special gifted children who no one has no one objects to. Our anti-CRT people don't object to programs and policies and initiatives that support there. The policy also says equity is distinct from equality, while equality entitles everyone to get the same. Equity requires that individuals get what they need. And then they say that this policy reflects the district's commitment to ensuring students, employees, or families who have been who have historically experienced opportunity or achievement gaps due to race, color, ethnicity, national origin, language, immigration status, sex assigned at birth, sexual orientation, gender identity, etc., no longer encounter barriers. In light of social and historical context, this policy provides explicit permission to treat people differently when circumstances, necessitate that something different needs to be done. And finally, or primarily, they say the value of equity is that the entire community benefits when individuals get what they need. The policy reflects the board's support in ensuring equity for all individuals in the district. The board authorizes the superintendent or its designee to develop and promulgate regulations designed to ensure that structural barriers are confronted and dismantled in service of meeting the needs of all individuals. I read nothing in that statement that says we're going to be reading, or actually not reading, but we will all be communists and socialists. So I'd like to open up the floor to questions or comments or thoughts.
If you have a question or comment, just hit your raise hand so we know when we can call on you and keep it somewhat organized. I'm also putting in the chat a link to a Google Doc that Annie and I did that has other resources.
So I see Jamie has a question.
Yeah, I think it's more of a comment. So I had, or my family had an experience with CRT at Friend Central where both Anita and my son attended. They were, or her sons, they were in the same grade. Our family had been there since pre-K. Anita and her family came, I think, towards middle school or a little later. Friend Central is I went there, my family is super progressive. My mom is far left of left. My family's a well-known Democratic supporters in Philadelphia, very well-known. I'd never voted for anybody but Democrats my entire life. I picked Friend Central. I went to GFS and then we picked Friend Central because it was the most progressive school on the main line that was within reasonable driving distance to our house that wouldn't become onerous because I work full time and fly all over the country for my job, as does my husband, has a busy job. The mission of the school at Friend Central was equity, inclusion, and that was the centerpiece of the curriculum on all of these issues that Anita listed in her presentation: race, gender, socioeconomic, et cetera. In 2016, they put into place, what we now call this critical race theory. And over the next 3 years, between my son was in 10th grade then, and but my older son, the same one that was with Anita's boys. And by the end of the school, those 3 years as the school that I had loved and been at since pre-K became unrecognizable. It took all of these topics, which was always a total centerpiece of the school, all of these things. It was inclusive. It was compared to most schools on the main line, it was, much more racially mixed than, let's say, the public schools. And it made those topics completely and utterly toxic. It ended with 3 years of trauma. And I remember even one of Anita's son had a protest on his graduation hat at graduation from Friend Central because of the toxicity that ensued because of the critical race theory. There was lawsuits, multiple lawsuits, over 7 lawsuits by disabled people, Black and brown people, against the school that, and again, we had been there since pre-K. It never had anything like that happen. There were teams of lawyers brought in. There was interviews of students, and there were students that were recording other students without them knowing, and then putting it out, secretly. And there was anti-Semitism started to crop up, and there was students shouting and protesting. Rich Jews, stamped on First Amendment rights. There was my son was trying to, obviously he was in school to try and get into college and high school to prepare for college. So many of his classes, his advanced physics and chemistry and what have you, his high-level math classes were canceled because there was constant trauma and emergency meetings for all of the students because of the toxicity of the critical race theory that had brought into a school of self-selected progressive people. And it was horrific. And in the end, so many teachers who had been there for 30 or 40 years that were hippies from the 50s and 60s or 60s, who in their DNA wanted in every way to be progressive and inclusive on all of these things, gender, race, socioeconomic, they were essentially forced out of the school or asked to leave, and and because there was anonymous accusations and backbiting. So many of the wonderful Black and brown teachers and LGBT teachers that the school that had been at the school for years, they all left. There were lawsuits by some of them, the teachers that were also kind of pushed out from the trauma and the toxicity.
Jenny, can I just interject for 1 second? Because I think what's happening in what you're saying is, again, a conflagration between what Friends Central did and critical race theory. I want to be clear again that what critical race theory is a theory that's studied in law and in graduate school. And what critical race theory does is it looks at how systems have disadvantaged people. For example, if I was looking at education and critical race theory, I would say that when the 14th Amendment was devised, there was a sense that there would be equality, we're all citizens. But then there was Plessy versus Ferguson. And then the courts as institutions said that we can be separate and equal. And that disadvantaged people of color. The law said that we would have a Social Security Act, but the Social Security Act did not apply to people who are domestic laborers or people who were farm workers, those people who were predominantly Black and brown. That's what critical race theory does. But so for Friends, I don't know that.
Okay, well, let me try and clarify, because I'm sure you know, Anita, I've been a lawyer in Philadelphia for
Jamie.
Sorry, can I just finish my point? I've been a lawyer for 30 years in Philly, so I'm very familiar. And one of the arguments was that, well, these are Republicans, right-wing people who don't know what critical race theory is because they've never experienced it. Well, I'm telling you about a school in our community that did experience it. And the critical race theory was put into place in our progressive school, and this was the outcome. So that's all I'm saying. I'm just talking about firsthand experience. I know well, Plessy versus Ferguson and all of the law, but I'm talking about a firsthand experience of what happened in a school in Lower Merion School District that put critical race theory into place, and this was one particular outcome. So that's all I'm saying.
Right, and I appreciate to hear what you're saying, but I don't understand, unless there was a course at the school that systemically looked at laws and how they adversely impacted people of color, then they weren't putting critical race theory into place. The other thing that I wanted to say is that critical race theory is an evolving concept, and it also looks at gender and how systems are in place that disadvantage certain groups of people. It's evolving. I have read Dr. Crenshaw, who is a part of the group that developed the concept of critical race theory. So again, unless the school has a course on theory, they may have called it critical race theory, but it's not what it is. Kim, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, and I'm sorry I can't have my video. I'm on my phone. So I feel, as I expressed in a Script Forum, kind of woefully ignorant about critical race theory, and I'm very pleased. Thank you for putting this together, and Anita, thank you for presenting this. I just had a couple of statements. I've been hearing a lot, again, mostly on social media forums, about this notion of people needing to express how liberal or progressive they are before they express how against critical race theory they are. And I do think there's a misunderstanding. Anita, I find it really interesting with you making the analogy between gifted programs. I think that's a really critical analogy to make, because I think it's also critical that we realize in our district, as well as I'm sure many other districts, just the qualifications to get into these gifted programs are by nature biased. When we look at the qualifications when they're looking at third graders getting into the gifted program and then being labeled and basically tracked, because make no mistake, in Lower Merion School District, kids are tracked from first grade on. And if you go into Lower Merion High School and take a look at non-AP 10th, 11th, and 12th grade classes, that tracking is all too clear. So one thing, the whole notion of everyone saying, well, I'm progressive and I come from this progressive family and we go to a progressive school and our schools are there to prepare our kids for college and we're very liberal, I think it misses the point. Just the fact, I mean, there's so many things that get me about this. And again, I don't fully understand critical race theory. I do understand what it means when Lower Merion School District tracks our kids. I do understand what it means when you have a young man who was killed and 3 other young men whose lives were forever changed, and our district makes not one statement about it. And then in a very weird backtracking way comes out after this latest tragedy and tries to backtrack by saying, well, we had a moment of silence at our school board. That's not acceptable. And it all needs to be a part of this dialogue. It is about what's taught, but it's about how we're making decisions about who gets into certain classes and why are we basing these on IQ scores when we know IQ tests are biased. So I have a really hard time, and it's no offense to anyone. I'm a white liberal. I own that. I wear it proudly, but I'm also smart enough to know that I'm a white liberal who doesn't get it, and that we need to listen to other people that get it more than we do. And it's not about alienating anyone. And I think it goes way above what exactly is taught in the classroom, although I think it's a huge part of it. I think our district, and I forget which district it was, Adrian, on the NAACP forum that you had that said they actually eliminated tracking in their elementary schools. I was blown away by that, totally blown away by that. These are discussions that will, I think, cause a lot of a lot of people who talk about their kids being in 5 AP classes and AP this and AP that. Lucy at one board meeting mentioned how they're desperately trying to reach out to minority populations to recruit them into our gifted programs. Well, if you have to desperately look into communities to recruit them into your gifted programs, there's something wrong with the gifted program. And so I think that these are bigger discussions, but that was my statement. I'm very pleased to learn more about critical race theory because I know very little about it. So thank you, everyone, Adrian and Anita and Annie. Thank you for, as always, making this possible.
Isabel, you're correct. I'm going to just read from those who developed CRT. And again, Jamie, I'm not objecting or saying that there wasn't a problem at Friends Central, but it was not CRT. Let me be very clear again what critical race theory is. The tenets include recognition that race is not biologically real, but is socially constructed and socially significant. It recognizes that science, as demonstrated by the Human Genome Project, refutes the idea of biological racial differences. Race is the product of social thought and not connected to a biological reality. 2, CRT acknowledges that racism is a normal function of society and is embedded within systems and institutions like the legal system that replicate racial inequality. This dismisses the idea that racist incidents are aberrations, but are instead manifestations of structural systemic racism. It rejects the popular understanding about racism, such as arguments that confine racism to a few bad apples. CRT recognizes that racism is codified in the law, embedded in structures, and woven into public policy. It rejects claims of meritocracy or colored blindness. It recognizes that it is the systemic nature of racism that bears primary responsibility for racial inequality. And it recognizes the relevance of people's everyday scholarship. That includes embracing the lived experiences of people of color, including those preserved through storytelling, and rejecting deficit-informed research that excludes the epistemologies of people of color. That's what CRT is.
And I want to add that this is not what they're teaching in schools. What they're teaching in schools, which is being conflict graded with CRT, which is way more complex than I'm even having a problem comprehending it, and it sounds like many of us are also. This is not what they're teaching. What the schools want to do is teach our kids the history. And what Isabel said, that that CRT is teaching our kids how the US used laws to disadvantage Blacks. No, history. We're teaching history. And that history is showing kids how laws were used to disadvantage Blacks through, for example, Plessy versus Ferguson, Jim Crow, redlining, and Social Security that Anita talked about, and the whole just teaching an accurate, authentic.
And not just, as Tom Hassani is saying, the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment, women's rights. You know, again, CRT is not a noun, it's a verb that analyzes structures that disadvantage people. I mean, that's what it is. Hadass? Mr. Sheffer, you wanted to say something?
Miss, it's okay. Yes, I really appreciate the clarity that you brought to this, Dr. Friday. And I want to say that looking in the broader context of what is happening in Monco and the huge struggle that we're going to be seeing going into the 22 elections here, and some very vocal members of our community, we need to see this in the bigger picture of politicizing our schools and politicizing the community as Republicans are trying to get Monco back. And I think calling this CRT in schools, I agree with you, Dr. Friday. It's not the right terminology. It's taught in college or graduate school. So how can we reduce the heat, lower the heat, maybe find a different terminology for it? I think people are reacting to critical, not understanding that critical is just a way of teaching, an example. And that this really is a theory. It's not a practice. It can lend itself to practices, but what the schools are teaching is kindness to other people, is recognizing that other people bring different family histories, right? My kids went through LM. through Kinwood and now through the high school. Other than, and I asked them about it, they said other than Black History Month, nothing was ever mentioned. They want more. They want to understand more about why kids who don't look like them, kids who are not white, are not showing up in classes as often. Why, teachers aren't allowing them to speak as often. Why they are sitting by themselves in the cafeteria. My kids want to understand more, and the school has not delved into any kind of CRT, as far as I can see, after having kids in the school. So maybe we can lower the heat a little bit by not feeding into this panic reaction of, oh my God, my kids are going to be brainwashed.
Right.
Explain maybe in different terms. I'm a linguist by training. I know the power of words. And what I see here is a lot of heat because of some words.
And I appreciate what you're saying. And just briefly on the politicalization of this, and that is, in 2000, President Trump did an executive order that excluded federal contracts with any group that did diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And then among the content considered divisive was critical race theory. And that's how this has become a tool. Just like race language has been a tool, and just like, a woman killed her children and was able to say that a Black person did it, and on and on and on and on. It's a tool. Mr. Hassani, you wanted to say something?
Yes, thank you. So critical race theory, pretty much since the murder of George Floyd, we've been seeing, just all sorts of language around things that people of color have been doing, from calling peaceful protests riots and so on and so forth. And there has been an effort, a concerted effort by mostly alt-right to generate some sort of hate or some sort of messaging that their side can be united against, some of the things and some of the power that has been gained through the death of George Floyd. So it's pretty much like anything that could have been found to actually diminish the strength of people as they start understanding and start recognizing that DEI is important to teach to young people, has been made. That effort took the form of standing against CRT, this thing that had originally nothing to do with DEI necessarily. And it's being used to call DEI education. So if they're demonizing CRT, but they really mean DEI education, they're literally trying to erase people of color from their historical textbooks. That's the whole point of why it's such a big deal. Things that have been previously erased, like situations like leveling of, Black wealth, towns full of Black wealth. And so that's really what this whole CRT situation is, because Democrats did not bring this up, that's nothing having to do with CRT, but we did say we need to start making sure that the history is correct and full and includes people of color, people of Asian descent, Black descent, every kind. So there's a whole movement called Make Us Visible to teach more education about people that, maybe a sentence about the United States, for example, owning the Philippines. And when the Philippines celebrates its independence, it's from America. We don't know about anything about that. No one ever teaches anything about that. There's one little sentence sometimes in some textbooks, even in the North, the way amazing, North that we're all in and a part of. Racism is everywhere. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say why education, true education, is so important. And I'll give an example of something. I did a class when my daughter was in second grade with a teacher at Baldwin. They were studying a textbook on Indians. And she and I created a curriculum. And one of the classes that we did was we looked at 1492. And we asked the children what they knew about 1492. And they said, Christopher Columbus discovered America. And I said, okay, let's think about that. And we drew the globe, or we drew different maps on the board. And we said, from one perspective, Christopher Columbus discovered America. But let's look at where he actually landed, in the Caribbean. Oh, said the children. Then we said, now where was Christopher Columbus going? And why was he on the voyage? Well, he was going east to get spices from India. So little second graders, if you were Indian, what would you say about Christopher Columbus? He was lost. Second graders, if you were a part of the Taino tribe that was in the Caribbean and you knew that your tribe would be exterminated because of his discovery, what would you say? Wow, he killed a lot of people. 7-year-olds looking at a date from a multiple perspective. At the end of that term, the children were asked to write statements about what they had learned. And one little girl, 7, said, I've learned that I will never take information from one place. I want my world to be fuller. I want to know more. That's what education is. That's what we want for our children. That's what a diverse curriculum that speaks of multiple perspectives and a fuller sense of history would provide. Those are the tools that our children will all need, including opponents of CRT, will need to survive in this world that's coming. So again, I don't see how that led to communism. I don't see how that destroyed family structure. I don't see how that said white was wrong. Am I wrong? Ruth. I mean, you're muted, Ruth. Ruth Jenkins, yeah, there you go.
Okay, Ruth Jenkins. As a school teacher for many years, I think it's so important not to present just the surface, as you were talking about, that you just get the facts and the dates and the events, and then you're finished. As opposed to delving into, what were the causation factors, what were the results of particular situations. And I remember even teaching World War II and the invasion of the Netherlands and the sequestering of Anne Frank, and having the students write a letter in their diary as if they were in the annex, and get the feeling of what it's like to have been sequestered for those 2 years under Nazi rule. And I think that it's really important in our school system that we get the feeling of how people felt to be slaves, to be Native Americans, to be the Chinese who built the railroads, but yet could not live in neighborhoods or join restaurants, the people that were in the Japanese internment camps, even the people now in Guantanamo Bay. We really need to listen to the old voices, the faraway voices of the people who came before us and built our history. And the only way to do that is to let them speak, is to give them a voice through our students.
Right. I mean, and when you talk about Anne Frank and staying in the attic, another theme can be what people do for freedom, for survival. We could talk about Brown, who mailed himself to Philadelphia so that he could be free. We could talk about people who were in internment camps. I mean, and so by talking about those ideas, teaching those ideas, then the values that we all have as human beings, the want of freedom, the want of, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness as theoretically, part of what we as a nation stand for, are values that we say that we want. So again, when folks say, CRT is bad because it's saying that white is bad, it's saying that there are values, that we all share. I haven't been looking at the chat and I see there are a lot of comments.
Yes.
So I see that Tom said, was it just the mere teaching of CRT that caused all of this? No, what started all of this is CRT becoming a buzzword like Black Lives Matter, a buzzword like defund the police, a tool to object to anti-racist, expansive, humanistic thinking. And those terms being misused as a tool. Yeah, so are there any more questions, thoughts? All right.
Okay. I just put the link to the Google form survey that Stand Up for Lower Merion that I spoke at the beginning, is a communication survey. And we wanted to get enough participants take this so that in the fall, when we bring it to the school district in one of their policy and communication meetings, actually both of those, that they will know what the community wants. What's happening now is just no way to make it easy to communicate with the school board. By the time you get to a school board meeting, everything has been decided already. So you're after the fact. If you want to get in on it, you have to go to the subcommittee meetings. And we're trying to figure out how to make those subcommittee meetings more accessible for more people. And also, one of the things that I want to say is I think a key point is when somebody starts discussing CRT in the schools, just say, that's not my understanding. My understanding is that it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. What do you have against that? And I think it takes them aback a bit. And I've seen that happen. That is not going to happen with people who are so far to one side that there's no talking with them. But because so many of us just have no concept of what critical race theory is, and by saying and by the fact that it's determined to be a theory means that it's not a fact. The word theory means that we think it's that way, but it hasn't been proven. And so, I think that send them back, because this is recorded. We're going to have it up on the YouTube channel. I'm
sorry. Also, just look at the Lower Merion policy on equity, and what is there that people can object to about that?
And Lower Merion's policy is followed by a list of definitions. So when I think having common definitions makes for easier communication. Again, that is in the copy link. That is in our little doc that we put more information. There's question and answers from Juniper and Easttown. There's a link to the Lower Merion School District equity work, and in there, there's a link to their actual equity policy. So I want to thank everyone for attending. I think that we all learned something, and I especially want to thank Anita Friday, who is my co-executive committee member on Mainline Branch NAACP also. There is just so much we all have to learn, and we have to try and keep it civil. We really do. And not get into the hysterics that has been happening around this. I've been to several Haverford Township school board meetings, and the vitriol it's terrible. It's really terrible. And we're just hoping to lower the temperature by having proper information.
I see that Jill wants to have one more question. Yes, Jill? Jill?
Here she comes.
Hi, sorry. Anita, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, can you hear
Yes.
me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I think there were maybe 5 statements that you made that were the arguments against critical race theory that you mentioned in the beginning. Did you, is that correct? That the ones that you listed, is
Right,
that what they were, are kind of like the opposing views?
When the different East Town School District had a board meeting a few weeks ago where there was a huge public uproar. People who were opposed to CRT put papers with that language in folks' mailboxes. And I was reading what they put in people's mailboxes. You know, some of the things.
So is there any way you could, oh, I was just gonna say, could you share those just so we're aware of what some of those are and can kind of be prepared with, factual information, in our school district?
So I took a
I'm
picture
sure
of
some of those
the flyer, and I
would
can
come
email
up
it.
in
I'm
Lower
sorry.
Merion as they did in T.
Yeah, I took a picture of the flyer, and I can share it with Adrienne, and then she can do it, because it's just a picture from my phone. Yeah.
Okay, and what I'll do is I'll go back in the recording and try and transcribe Anita's answers to each one of those, because I think that's just as important. Oh yeah, I see a couple heads shaking. All right, so I want to thank everybody for coming. We're well past our usual hour time, but I think this was a good conversation, and I hope everyone learned a lot. You'll get an email. Everybody will get the email with a link to the YouTube channel and this recording. And I hope you all have a lovely week.
Thank you, everyone.